Beads and bones and behold thrones of farm and herb garden we grow, learning how they live we know, very little but still explore how it could have been before, of times long past, of peace and war, of crafts and builds to ancient lore, discovering here at Jarrow Hall.
Hello and welcome to the Jarrow Hall Podcast. We're here from the northeast of England at our little museum called Jarrow Hall. We're all about Anglo-Saxon Northumbria. We do cover some local history as well. And we are volunteers here to talk about everything about archaeology, projects, exhibitions. We'll dip into the collections, the events that we've got on, and all sorts and everything to do with the museum. I'm Sam.
I'm Chris.
And I'm Luke.
Today we'll start off with the beginning of the museum.
Yeah, I guess we should introduce who we are. So, Jarrow Hall Anglo-Saxon Farm, Village and Bede Museum is an 11-acre site, as Sam said, in the northeast of England. We're an open-air museum. We're one of very few museums that deal with the early medieval period in Britain. And just to give a bit of context, our museum is right next to St. Paul's Church in Jarrow, which was built or finished in 685 and was originally part of the Venerable Bede's monastery of Wearmouth, Jarrow, which is then part of the Kingdom of Northumbria. I'm a history nerd, so this will be my main contribution to the podcast, but there's a lot more going on at the site. Luke, I think you're more heavily involved with the experimental archaeology side of things. That'd be fair to say.
Yeah, I come from an archaeology background, so I've spent a lot of time working on the buildings on site, trying to improve them, keep them up to standard. Everything from crafting with woodworking, heritage skills, to daubing the walls, thatching roofs, anything you can really think of.
Magic happens when Luke's on site, basically. Things that you think were impossible and that you'll need funding for, and you go away to draft a funding bid and you find out that Luke came in on his day off and did it without anyone noticing. That's happened quite a few times, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah. It's very organised and gets
yeah.
stuff done.
Captain Luke. Wouldn't be here without him. And
what about you, Chris? What is it that you do?
I don't do a great deal, to be honest. I just come in for the showy bits like this. But I think my main interest is our indoor museum, our Age of Bede exhibit, which it's been around for about 30 years. So just to give a bit more background, Jarrow Hall Museum had its origins in the 1970s, and it was used as the home for the archaeological finds from the monastic sites at Wearmouth and Jarrow that were excavated by Dame Rosemary Cramp of Durham University. From there, the original museum, which was based in Jarrow Hall House, which is an 18th century building, which is now part of the museum. From there, it expanded into this experimental archaeological site, which was called Bede's World to begin with, and included a reconstructed long hall that we're sitting in right now, and a few other reconstructed buildings. And Bede's World was in kind of a thriving museum for about 30 years before it was forced to close down, and then we reopened as Jarrow Hall, and we've never really looked back since then. I mean, we've regained our museum accreditation from Arts Council England. We're a member of EXARC, the Association of Experimental Archaeological Museums, and we've received a lot of lottery funding recently to renovate our long hall and our collections, and also to fix the roof in the museum. So we're kind of going from strength to strength.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a very long-winded way of answering your original question, which is I like to just hang out in the museum. And
You do a lot of reenacting and things.
I do
as well,
a bit of
don't you?
I do a bit of reenacting. I'm a member of the Friends of the World of Bede as well, which is the academic charity which supports the museum. And I've been involved with most of the groups that interact with the museum. Not the Gregorian choir, because I can't sing, but everything else besides.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been around since, I think it was 2017 that I started volunteering.
Yeah, shortly before me, wasn't it?
Because it was when Bede's World closed and then it reopened under Groundwork. And I thought, I'm going to volunteer because I really love the place. I was a visitor before then, quite regular, and had my baby shower here and everything. And
That's pretty cool.
yeah, so I kind of started volunteering just to pitch in so that we
Yeah.
could keep the museum. And it's evolved a lot since then. Like, it's come such a long way since the beginning.
Absolutely. I think, I mean, I loved the site when it was Bede's World. I always wanted to be a volunteer here, and when it came out quite suddenly in the press that Bede's World had the liquidators had been called in and the site was closing, I was gutted. So I was really pleased when we reopened on a much smaller scale as Jarrow Hall and primarily volunteer-led. There's a lot fewer staff now than there was when the site was Bede's World, and I think we've done a really good job with our different skill sets at pitching in and driving the museum forward. How did you come to be a volunteer, Luke?
Yeah, well, I was doing an archaeology degree at Newcastle University, and they happened to have an open day here. So part of the course, we had to come here and do 2 weeks worth of experimental archaeology, which was the main introduction, which as soon as I stepped on site, I remembered it from when I came on school trips when I was younger. I could never remember exactly where I'd been until I stepped through the entranceway of the museum again, saw the fountain all the way through the exhibition. We spent a lot of time down the village doing some Bronze Age smelting, other amazing experimental archaeology activities like that. And from there I went, ooh, I really like this place. I want to get involved. So a couple of weeks after that, post came out saying, oh, we're going to try and build a traditional Anglo-Saxon style chicken coop. And I thought, yes, I'll come along. Spent 4 weeks straight off the bat here, trying to build what is now classed as Duckington Palace. It's a nice grand structure.
Sorry?
Duckington Palace.
Duckington Palace.
Yeah.
Duckington Palace.
I like that.
That's what we ended up calling it.
Duckingham Palace. Was that not the... Oh, well. Duckington sounds better. I'm happy to go with that. But you do a lot of daubing as well. I mean, you more or less completely... I know you did quite a bit as well, Sam, but a lot of the redaubing work, and by daubing I mean sort of plastering in a medieval sense.
It's not finished yet, is it? But
Yeah.
we've still got a long way to go. And I know the Sage volunteers came in and did quite a lot. And
So I guess we should give a shout out to Sage, which is a software company which specialise in accountancy and payroll software, and they are very generous in supporting the museum. They quite often have volunteer days where 50 or 60 Sage staff will come and help with maintaining our buildings, and we couldn't do what we do without them.
No, the work they've done is amazing.
So we're talking about the recent history.
Yeah.
What about the very beginning? Where did it start? Why is the museum here in the first place?
Well, the museum had its origins in the 7th century when the king of Northumbria, Edgefrith, at the time was having a lot of trouble with a bishop of his, a guy called Wilfrid. And Wilfrid was very overbearing. He was the Bishop of Hexham. At various times he was also the Bishop of the whole of Northumbria. And Edgefrith wanted another ecclesiastical authority, a kind of counterweight to Wilfrid's influence. Now, there was a Northumbrian nobleman called Benedict Biscop, who was very well travelled. He was also, like Wilfrid, from an aristocratic background. And during his life, he made 6 journeys to Rome to gather books. And as a monk, he served in 17 different monasteries in France and Italy. And he had the idea of building Benedictine monastery like the ones he'd seen on the continent back home in England. And it was not been certain that this would be in Northumbria. He was quite happy to build it in Wessex. That was his original plan. But Edgefrith, the king of Northumbria, threw the kitchen sink basically to get Benedict Biscop to come back and build a monastery here in Northumbria. So the first site, St. Peter's Church in Wearmouth, was finished in 674, and Edgefrith gave a huge amount of land to the monastery. He gave 70 hides of land. Now, a hide isn't a fixed unit of measurement. It's the amount of land you need to support a family. So we think there were maybe 400, or perhaps as many as 400 monks at the monastery of Wearmouth. And it was such a success that a few years later, Edgefrith gave a further 40 hides of land to build a sister site here in Jarrow, and that was St. Paul's Monastery. And that was completed in 685, shortly before Edgefrith was killed in battle. And at some point, the Venerable Bede, who started his career at Wearmouth, came here to Jarrow, where he died in the year 735. And his remains stayed here until about the 11th century when they were transferred to Durham Cathedral, where you can still see them today. I guess we should probably talk a bit about who Bede is.
Yeah,
Would that be fair to say? Yeah, I'll try and keep it short. So
yeah, because it was quite brilliant, wasn't it?
it was a big deal, yeah.
The main focus of
monastic learning,
yeah.
really. And like I say, tells us most of what we know of what was going on in the British Isles in the sort of 5th to the 7th centuries. So Bede was born in the year 673 or thereabouts, and he tells us very little about himself, but he mentions that he was born within the sort of bounds of the monastery, so within that huge grant of land that the king had given to Benedict Biscop to build his dual site monastery at Weymouth Jarrow. And he was a very, very precocious and gifted scholar, and it was identified at an early age that he had a lot of promise. He was made a deacon at the age of 19 and a priest at the age of 30, and these are both quite young ages to attain those ranks, if you like. And the fact that he's ordained as a priest rather than a monk shows that they had big plans for Bede. He had the scope to take his practice outside of the monastery walls. But his greatest skill was as a teacher, and a lot of his most popular works were about computus and basically calculating the correct date of Easter. But I'm going to try and tone this down a bit, but his best known work is the ecclesiastical history. And I guess one big impact of Bede's histories is that he took a little known dating system called AD, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, and he used it in all of his historical works. And Bede's histories were so popular that the BC AD dating system became the system that we use in the Western world until this day.
Fab.
So that's a pretty big legacy.
Yeah,
so Bede
world
didn't.
over.
Yeah, I mean Bede didn't invent that system, but it's the reason why we call this the year 2025 rather than the third year of the reign of King Charles, which we would have used a dating system like that before
That's
Bede
something
came
a lot
along.
of people take for granted, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then a few years later, so once Bede died and all the rest of it, and some history happened, and then we dug it back up.
That's right. So Rosemary Cram decided to dig it up again in the middle of the 20th century.
When were the first excavations? Was it the 60s? Was it or the
I
70s?
believe the first excavations began in the 1950s, but
The 50s?
the late 50s. And I think they continued in different stages right through the 1980s.
Yeah.
But I think probably, and you'll know more about this than me, Luke, that one of Rosemary Cram's big achievements was not only to excavate the sites at Weymouth Jarrow, but to write everything down and actually get it published, because that doesn't happen as often as you might think with big excavations.
Big excavations, a lot of work has to go in afterwards to get all the processing done of all the finds that are dug up, of analysis of them, and even conservation. Because all the finds, once they come out the ground, a lot of them will will just degrade very quickly. So she's had to do a lot of work to get them all looked after, conserved, find all the funding, and then it's the eventual writing it up. So she wrote 2 huge volumes, one solely to all the finds she'd pulled up, and analysing, saying what they actually are, how important they were, how it all connected to the site, the local community, and then the actual main text to try and do the analysis of the site, looking at how it might have been used, what sort of buildings it was, different timescales, how the site sort of developed throughout the hundreds of years it was used, which places, extensions, and how they were sort of utilised.
That's a huge amount of work, and I guess the fact she wasn't able to publish that until 2005, almost 30 years after the bulk of the excavations were finished, shows the amount of work involved in just cataloguing, writing up, and detailing all of the finds. And thanks to Rosemary Cramp, we know exactly which parts of the monastery have been excavated, which parts haven't. I guess, should we talk a bit about where the site is located?
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, so I mean, the monastery at St. Paul's is right next to the secular medieval town of Jarrow, which is situated on the River Don, which feeds into the River Tyne and is right next to Jarrow Slake, which is now the modern Tyne Dock, where the Port of Tyne
It's pronounced
authorities-
slack.
Slack. Well, Jarrow Slack. It's written Slake, but never mind. Jarrow Slack, which is the biggest natural harbour on the Tyne, and it's never really been looked at by archaeologists. So potentially an awful lot of stuff there still waiting to be found from the secular remains of Anglo-Saxon and medieval Jarrow. But yeah, we'll have to watch that space and see what happens.
So how did the museum come about since the excavations? Was the museum there already? Because we already knew a lot about the history, or...
Yeah, I mean, we knew that there was a monastery at Wearmouth Jarrow, but we didn't know anything about the structure of it, how it looked. So we were entirely dependent on the works of Bede, particularly his History of the Abbots of Wearmouth Jarrow, which talks about how the site was built, who the abbots were. And what the excavations showed was that the monasteries were exactly where Bede said they would be. We knew, of course, where the churches were, but the layout of the monastery at Wearmouth corresponded to the description given by Bede in his history. And Jarrow, what was very exciting was we found a huge amount of 7th century stained glass. And again, this chimes with what Bede tells us in his History of the Abbots of Wearmouth Jarrow and his ecclesiastical history, where he mentions that Benedict brought over glaziers from France to fit out both churches with stained glass windows. So
I'm going to cut in here, and you know a hell of a lot more than me, but I'm going to correct you on the stained glass, because there's an argument saying that it's coloured glass, not stained glass, because of the way that the colour is applied to the glass. There's
we're
a
getting into
difference
semantics
there.
a lot here today, Sam, aren't
Yeah, yeah. Got to keep you right,
different
though.
styles
It's
of how
one,
it's
one of
been
these
made.
things that comes up a lot in the
Okay,
museum.
so we have coloured glass or stained glass, depending on which nomenclature you prefer. But yeah, we've got a lot of fancy-looking glass, the biggest collection of fancy glass from that period that's been found in Europe. And we have there's a reconstructed window that was made from that glass.
Yeah.
And I don't know if anyone's played the video game Assassin's Creed Valhalla, but you'll find that the Jarrow Anglo-Saxon stained glass window is used for every single monastery in that game. So that's quite cool, right?
Very cool.
That's really cool. I was excited to discover that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you've got Assassin's Creed Valhalla, nerdy fact, have a look around when you're raiding one of the churches and you'll see some Jarrow glass on the window there. But in terms of the excavations, I mentioned Jarrow Hall House, I think, which was built in 1785, quite a nice country house that had been owned by the local council since the 1930s. And that was used to house the finds from the excavations at Wearmouth Jarrow. And really the museum begins from there. From Jarrow Hall House, our Bede Museum was built right next to it. And in the 1990s, we acquired an old chemical works, and on that site, we built our 11-acre open-air museum. So all of the buildings we've got are based on archaeological finds, or archaeological sites from Northumbria. That's right, Luke?
Yeah, so like the building we're sat in right now, we've got in the Thirlings, this is our main Great Hall. This is from a site called Yevering in Northumberland. So it's an amazing site, and this is one of the biggest buildings which we've found there. So we've recreated it from what we could find. So all that was left at the time was some post holes in the ground. So we were able to plot out exactly where all the posts would have been. So from there, we had, when it was built in the 90s, we had some master craftsmen come in, carved all the posts, put them in place, and then had to effectively design the building around them.
Yeah.
So they've used the knowledge that they had at the time with just a collection of the tools which have been found on site or from related sites. So all known to be authentic, and worked out what joints and tools they could have made. And we knew we had thatched roofs because that was the most popular material that they would use. Sort of from agriculture, they grow the grain, and the offcuts is what they would be able to use for the roofs. So they used all their knowledge that they've been able to build up over time to create what is an experimental archaeology building, but it's the best replica that they could think of at the time of what they would have had.
Yeah, I think we call this a reimagining rather than a reconstruction, because we just, as you said, that we just found some. Well, they just found some post holes in the ground at this site, and I think Thirlings it's about 4 miles from the royal site at Yevering, and from memory, I think when this museum was built, we originally wanted to build the Royal Hall at Yevering, which is about 3 times the size of where we are now, but we just didn't have the money. So this was kind of a good second option, but trying to recreate an Anglo-Saxon building, it's like trying to draw a picture of a person based on their footprints, because you kind of know the size and maybe the potentially the height based on the depth of the columns of the structure.
Yeah.
But in terms of the finish on the columns, the interior decoration, we don't know that much, really, do we?
No, because there is, from different examples, we know that occasionally they would have plastered the walls. So yes, some of the walls we've got now we're partway through working, but quite often we would expect them to be actually quite smooth, nearly as close as modern walls, and they would have been plastered with a lime plaster, which would have left nice white coloured walls, which would have helped light up the room. And on some sites we have found painted glaze, sort of painted plaster. So we expect that they did have access and would have potentially have put some sort of murals or other artwork on the walls as well. So their local history, stories of the time, even animals, iconography, anything like that could have possibly been on the walls as well. Because we've got them on their shields, on the sort of metalwork that we've got, so we know some of them have survived. And it's just because the way these buildings are built out of wood and effectively dirt, they don't last the test of time as well as sort of the more sturdy materials. So it has come to the light of when this was built, a lot of research put into how exactly do we think it would have looked being built. So yes, the way we've got it built here is a bit more rustic. We've got all the poles, the posts around here, they're finished to sort of a useful standard, but there is a chance, as in other replicas around the country, that they were highly carved. They were all specialist craftsmen at the time. They were extremely skilled, would have coppiced the trees, had all the tools, chisels, axes to carve the posts as they would. And there's a high chance they would have carved in iconography stories onto the posts themselves, not just even painted the walls, and had it as a status symbol. Because if it was the main hall on site,
It's a high status building.
yeah, the Thane or whoever was in charge at the time living in the building would have wanted to show off their wealth. So if they could get a bit of carving on the walls, an extra bit of painting, any sort of sword, shields hanging up, they would have probably done that to show that they've got wealth, they're successful, popular in the place. It is showing not just the Thane or the ruler, it is that community. It is most likely their main site of activity, where the main activities would have occurred, meetings, celebrations, anything like that.
That sounds like we need to get some adzes and carve out a nicer finish on these posts. Or the wood is probably a bit too old.
Yeah, but if we get a chance to build another building, then we can go all out on that.
We'll go all out on the next long haul that we build.
That's it, yeah.
That's a plan.
Yeah, and then we've got a few other buildings as well, haven't we? So
There's
we've
a lot
got
of buildings
the one
planned.
we call the Monk's Cell and the Grubenhaus.
Yeah,
so do
they're
you want
buildings
to-
that we've currently got, yeah.
So how would you describe the monk's cell then, Luke?
The Monk's Cell's a bit different to this. It's a lot smaller. It is all timber built rather than the door bores that we've got here. So the way they've done that is all the posts are about the same size, but they're close together. And what they've done is they've hewed the beams, made them all fit together, cut little slots into them, and effectively they've got panel walls. So they've been able to split logs into sort of planks, cut them down to the size they want, and they just slot in on top of each other. So all they do is just freestanding, just sit on top of one another, and they'll keep the wall. You can't go, as they sit in little grooves in the poles, there's no chance of them falling out. And
That's
it
a
is
beautiful
quite
building.
effective. And they've got, on that one, it's based from a site in Hartlepool.
Yeah.
So with that, we know where the posts were. Again, we don't know what's above, but we know approximate height of people, what they would have tried to use it for, and with the location, it is called a monk's cell, because we think it's a building that a monk would have lived in. It's enough space for them to have sort of cooking area, seating, tables in there to do their works. So it's a nice sized little home for them.
So it could have been a home or maybe a workshop as
Yeah,
well.
it could have even just been a workshop. So
How long ago was it that our reconstructions were built?
1995, I think, the three core buildings were
Yeah.
were
And
thrown
does that
up.
align with the creation of the museum?
I believe the museum, like I say, had its origins in the 1970s. I mean, I remember coming here as I'm a bit older than both of you. I remember coming here as a kid in the early 90s, and the museum building was in place, but work had just begun on the Thirlings, and that post, and these two ones were the only structural posts in place, and otherwise they'd mapped out where the other posts were going to be, but nothing else was upright. So I think in the mid 90s, that's when these building work began on these three.
Yeah.
And more recently, we have constructed another house, haven't we? After
Yeah.
a 30-year hiatus.
Because, we had the existing Gruben house, which was the third building that they had from the original site.
Oh yeah, we should probably talk a bit about that. So that's based on another site in Northumberland, isn't it?
Yeah. So a Gruben house is a German word for a sunken feature building. Effectively what that means is they dug a pit down into the ground, a nice rectangle, and effectively just built a roof over the top of it. There's a couple of different designs and inclinations of them and how people think they were built, because some they think has small walls just above and then the roof, but the ones we've got, one has half flooring, the other one is just on the base. So usually they're about 80 to a metre down into the ground, and they would have built their buildings in places on higher ground. So even though they're digging down into the ground, it would have still stayed dry for them.
Yeah, so lots of natural drainage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The reason for this is it's a lot of natural insulation because there's no chance of wind getting in, and the walls themselves help keep the heat in. So effectively they could have either lived on that bottom floor, so that in the hall just had steps down, or they could have had a planked flooring or something similar like that they lived on, so that would have created an air pocket underneath, which that would have helped keep the space warm. And there's quite a few different interpretations of what that space could have been used for.
It's quite a fancy interpretation that we went for with the original Gruben house,
Yeah.
wasn't it? With the planked wooden floor, which is, creating planks by hand with axes is not easy work. So
No.
We went for a very high status, I guess you'd say, or higher status interpretation originally, but more recently in 2020 we built another Gruben house, didn't we?
Yeah. Yeah, so we've got two Gruben houses. One's an old one that's fallen down, one's a new one. So it's interesting to hear the story of how the village is here.
Yeah.
What about let's move the focus up to the museum and the history of the actual museum, because it was originally in Jarrow Hall House, wasn't it?
That's right, yeah.
And then it moved. There was an actual building. It was designed and constructed.
Yeah, in a Romanesque
With
style, yeah.
with the intended purpose of it being a museum.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I believe Rosemary Cram secured the funding to build a bespoke museum building to house the finds from the dual monastic sites, and the layout of our museum building. It's in kind of a rectangular shape, so it matches the cloister of a medieval monastery. And when you go into our Age of Bede exhibit, it basically charts the history given by Bede in his ecclesiastical history. So it starts with the arrival of the Romans under Julius Caesar, and then the construction of Hadrian's Wall. And from there, it talks about the Romans withdrawing from Britain and how the Anglo-Saxons came to occupy that space and set up their own kingdoms, and how those kingdoms, Northumbria included, eventually come to form England. And there's a shared identity between these kingdoms, largely or heavily in part, thanks to Bede's history. So that's the kind of core exhibit we've got in our museum, but we also use it as a focal point for a lot of groups to meet here. So the Northumbrian scribes who practice calligraphy, we've got a Gregorian choir. As we mentioned earlier, we've got reenactment groups. The northeast branch of Regia Anglorum, which is a nationwide Viking Age reenactment site, uses this as their training ground. So there's an awful lot going on in the museum itself, and we're continuing to have new exhibitions, new temporary exhibitions in the museum building, and our most recent one is on Anglo-Saxon manuscripts. And this is important because they found a scriptorium when they did the excavations here, didn't they, Luke?
Yeah.
So we know from Bede that one of the big achievements of the Weymouth Jarrow Monastery was to produce 3 pandects, 3 complete copies of the Bible, which is very rare. Most churches would maybe have a copy of the Gospels, but they produced 3, and it would have needed 1,500 pages of, they say as many as 500 calves might have been slaughtered to produce the vellum for one of those Bibles. So to produce 3 shows how much land the monastery had. And they produced 1 Bible for Jarrow, 1 for Weymouth, and the third, the fanciest of them all, was called the Codex Amiartinus, and that was sent as a gift to the Pope. And it remains in Italy today in the Laurentian Library in Florence. And it's the oldest surviving copy of the Vulgate Latin Bible, and a huge achievement for the monastery here.
So now it's time for a bit of a fun fact file with one of our friends, Brúnwulf, who is an experienced Anglo-Saxon, a bard and an expert linguist, amongst many other fantastic things. So now it's time for Brúnwulf's banter. Take it away, Brúnwulf.
The etymology of the name of Jarrow is a very interesting story. It originates from an Anglo-Saxon word, or rather a phrase, in Jerwum, which means in the fens or in the marshes. By itself, the word Jeru is related to the word gore, and rather than being related to blood or meaning blood, it means something dirty or muddy. But this transformation of the word also has a J, which is very rare in English place names, purely because it was not a native sound until after the Norman invasion. And it's this preposition of in, which changes the sound of it. Rather than Jerwum, the N changes it to Jerwum, and that's how we get the phrase Jarrow.
Absolutely fascinating stuff. He's great, isn't he? Right. So we've got some questions, just a few.
Do we now?
Yeah, we've got some questions that Leo, our marketing guy, has sent us that he's getting from social media. So yeah, there's just a couple here. The first one is, was the Jarrow Hall house a museum before the dig, or was it opened as a result of the dig?
No, it wasn't a museum before the dig. The house was built by a chap called Simon Temple in 1785. He went bankrupt and lost it in 1812, and it came under control of the local authority in the 1930s, and they used it for storage until the site was repurposed as a museum in the 1970s. So no, it didn't become a museum until it was used for the excavations.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a beautiful house as well, and there is a very nice cafe there now.
Yeah. Oh, there is, yeah. I'll go there for coffee every time I'm here.
And if you're a vegan, the Hive is the place to go.
Yeah.
So we love Jarrow Hall House. Next question, what we got?
The other one was the house originally donated because it was previously owned by a pit owner or somebody?
Yeah, Simon Temple. So he lost it after going bankrupt, and it passed through a number of hands. But yeah, I don't know the exact circumstances, but the council took it on in the 1930s. And like I say, used it for storage and a number of different purposes before it became a museum in the 70s, which it kind of still is to this day.
Yeah, fantastic. I'll be going back to Hive for my lunch later, I think. Do a good salad.
Do it. Salads are awesome at the Hive.
Yeah. So the last question, which I told you there wasn't many, didn't I? The last question is the museum haunted?
It does depend who you ask. We do occasionally have regular ghost hunts on at the museum.
You don't find any ghosts though, do they? Although we do have Spook, don't we?
Spook the cat.
Spook the cat, yeah. So I think Spook
our 3 resident farm cats.
Our 3 resident farm cats. So they're probably the closest you'll find to a dark supernatural entity hanging around Jarrow Hall. If we do have ghosts, they're very modest and unassuming ghosts, very subtle, because I've not heard anything.
Yeah,
when I've been
I've heard lots
volunteering.
of stories. Like there's a ghost in the museum causes all sorts of trouble and strange noises and mysterious things that go on there.
Is that not just the plumbing though? I mean, we need to really change our plumbing and lighting systems.
Well, there's a
like-
potential, but I don't think the plumbing can move items around.
Yeah.
Now, I think personally,
Dubious.
if there are ghosts, they're going to be in Jarrow Hall House because that's the building that's been there for a lot of years.
Yeah.
The rest of them are all quite new buildings, and I
Yeah.
don't know.
Because the bulk of the museum
I don't know
is
how
on top
ghosts
of an old
work.
chemical works, so
Yeah, yeah. But
Who
what was here
knows?
before the chemical works? You know, maybe there was maybe there was like a whole bunch of Jarrovians who used to live here.
I mean, I don't think the church is haunted. I think we'd have heard about that if it
Well,
was.
it's a pretty holy place, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I think they've got their own spirits going on in there.
Yeah, good spirits. But I think we're gonna have to go with a no for now, in the absence of
I think
conclusive
it's
proof.
debatable depending on what you believe, and
Okay, so it's subjective,
'Cause,
but we don't have firm evidence of ghosts.
would
at
you
Jarrow
describe
Hall.
yourself as skeptic, Chris?
I would say I don't believe in ghosts, but for those that do, who knows? Maybe there's enough room for doubt.
What about you, Luke? What's your opinion on it? Do you think it's haunted? You've been on the ghost tours, haven't you?
Yeah, I've been on a couple of them. Yeah, they're interesting
Wearing a
to see.
sheet with holes over your eyes.
I haven't got that far. Well, yeah, some stuff I've seen I couldn't quite answer, but it depends who you ask. There could be an explanation somewhere.
Yeah.
So a
No.
range of views on our panel here.
Yeah.
Right,
Interesting
so-
stuff. And is that it for the Q&A?
Yeah, I think that's it. That's all the questions. We didn't get many because we're still new on there. I don't
Yeah,
think
well,
many
this is-
people have
This is episode
curiosities
1.
for the podcast yet. So if you do have questions, do send them in. Or if you've got nice facts or anything like that that you want to share, do send them in. You can contact us through social media or the website. Or if you come in person, you can talk to somebody on the desk. Send us your questions, send us your information, send us anything you want to share. We want to hear from you. We want to know what you think. We want to know your curiosities. It's all interesting stuff. If you do find time and you're in the area, or if you want to make a special trip to come to the area to visit the museum, it's definitely worth coming to. It's such a nice place. We get good feedback from all the visitors. They just come for the aesthetics, they come for the academic stuff, they come for
The animals.
animals, and we have a lot of events on it as well. So the next episode is going to be themed around Easter. We'll be talking about all the events and things like that we've got on over the springtime.
The history of Easter.
The history of Easter, yeah, that's
Bede's
it.
role in that Easter controversy.
Yeah, because he's very famous about that, isn't he?
He is indeed, yeah. But we'll cover that next time. And yeah, I think that's pretty good.
That's it. So thanks for watching, and thank you guys for talking. It's been really interesting. And thanks to Richard for doing all the camera work and helping set up and all the rest of it.
None of this would happen without Richard.
Yeah. I'll see you next time.
Yeah,
See you
see
next
you all
time.
later, guys. Bye.